I was walking past a local junior high school the other night, well after 7 p.m. It was already dark, right?
Yeah.
But the lights on the sports ground were still flooding the field.
Oh, yeah. Late practice.
Yeah. Through the fence, I could hear the sharp thwack of a baseball bat over and over and, see a few students going through drills. Standing off to the side, just watching, was a teacher. He must have been there since, 7 a.m.? He looked absolutely exhausted.
I can imagine.
The kids looked exhausted, too. It wasn't like, the passionate practice you see in movies. It was just this grim, repetitive motion, really robotic. A friend of mine, he's a teacher in Osaka, later told me this is just normal. It's Bukatsu, these mandatory club activities.
Right, Bukatsu. It's a huge part of the system.
So I asked him, are they useful? And he just gave this, tired laugh. We do it because we've always done it, he said.
Wow.
He said, honestly, everyone, the kids, the teachers, even the parents, we're all at our breaking point. But stopping, that feels more impossible than just showing up again tomorrow.
That's quite a statement, but it really captures it.
Yeah, that single scene, that feeling of a machine just running on fumes, a tradition that nobody really believes in anymore, but nobody can seem to stop. It's the perfect snapshot, I think.
I agree.
You see it, and you suddenly realize the glowing reports you hear about Japanese education. Well, they're missing the real story.
That is a powerful, visceral scene. And you're right, it perfectly encapsulates this deep disconnect we see when we actually dig into the data.
The disconnect between the reputation and the reality.
Exactly. Japan's education system, it has this global reputation, right? Yeah. Producing academically high-achieving, disciplined students. A lot of that comes from its philosophical focus on developing the whole person.
The holistic approach.
Yes, but beneath that polished, disciplined surface, there's just immense systemic pressure. And it's primarily driven by, crushing teacher workload and a kind of structural inertia. So our mission today, really, is to move beyond that anecdote, powerful as it is, and unpack the hard data. Look at the historical constraints driving that extreme fatigue for both students and educators.
Right.
We need to explore exactly why a system supposedly dedicated to holistic development is instead causing such widespread burnout and, frankly, institutional exhaustion.
Okay, so let's dive straight into the numbers then, because that's where this crisis really gets quantified, right? It moves from just one teacher's story to almost a global scandal when you compare it.
It does.
We often hear how disciplined and dedicated Japanese teachers are, but how does their workload actually stack up against their international peers? What does the data say?
Well, when we talk about work hours, Japanese teachers are, and this isn't an exaggeration, the global workload leader. We have some really critical data from the OECD's 2013 TALIS survey. That's the Teaching and Learning International Survey.
Okay, TALIS 2013.
Right. It looked at lower secondary school teachers, so junior high, and Japanese teachers reported the longest work hours out of all 34 surveyed countries. They clocked in an average weekly workload of, get this, 53.9 hours.
53.9. That sounds almost unbelievable, like a typo.
It's accurate. 53.9 hours per week on average. Now contrast that with the surveyed country average globally.
Which was?
Much lower. 38.3 hours per week.
Wow. So what's that, 15, 16 hours more?
15 and a half extra hours every single week. That's basically like adding 2 extra full work days onto the end of what teachers do elsewhere on average.
That's staggering.
It really is. And it points to, an entirely different professional culture. It seems driven by this deeply ingrained sense of duty and maybe what you could call cultural presenteeism. You just have to be there.
So where does that massive gap come from? 15 extra hours.
Yeah.
It can't just be teaching time, right? The actual time in front of a class isn't that dramatically different from, say, the US or Europe, is it?
No, you're right. The classroom instruction time isn't the main driver. The data confirms exactly what you saw in that opening scene. The primary, most significant factor pushing up these hours is the burden of extracurricular activities. Bukatsu.
Ah, the baseball practice.
Exactly. Teachers in Japan spend an average of 7.7 hours per week just on guidance and supervision for these activities. And that covers everything, highly competitive sports clubs, cultural organizations, the lot.
7.7 hours. Okay, and what's the global comparison for that specific activity? How much time do teachers elsewhere spend on extracurriculars?
Well, the surveyed country average for time spent on extracurriculars is just 2.1 hours per week.
2.1 compared to 7.7.
Yeah. Japan's figure is nearly 4 times the global average. And we really need to emphasize what this 7.7 hours means. It's not just an hour here or there.
Right.
These are activities that often happen after school, sometimes late into the evening. They frequently run on weekends, too. Sometimes they require travel, entire days dedicated to competitions or practice sessions.
And is this paid time? Or
That's the kicker. This time is often categorized as voluntary, or it falls under unpaid overtime. So what should ideally be a holistic character-building activity essentially becomes a mandatory, physically demanding second shift for these teachers.
wow, so that's a huge chunk. But it's not just the Bukatsu, is it? I've heard about the administrative burden, too.
Correct. That's another significant factor. The whole culture of paperwork, meetings, consensus building, it adds substantially to the load.
How much time we're talking about there?
Japanese teachers reported spending about 5.5 hours per week just on office work and administrative tasks.
Okay, and the global average for admin?
Much less again.
Yeah.
Only 2.9 hours. So nearly double the time spent on paperwork and admin tasks compared to their international colleagues.
Right.
So when you combine that heavy add-on load plus the required guidance for holistic development, things like student counseling, and then pile on that extreme extracurricular load, well, the cumulative effect pushes the average teacher deep into what we have called hazardous territory.
Okay, let's talk about that. Hazardous territory, that sounds serious. We need to bring in this metric that connects chronic overwork to its gravest potential consequence. Karōshi, death by overwork.
Yes. And this, I think, is perhaps the most shocking metric we have in this whole deep dive. There's an established criterion, often used medically and legally, to link a worker's death to overwork.
What is that threshold?
It's generally defined as exceeding 80 hours of overtime per month. That basically equates to routinely working 60 hours or more per week.
60 hours a week, consistently.
Consistently. And when we look at the percentage of teachers in Japan who actually exceed this potentially life-threatening threshold,
Yeah.
the numbers are, well, they're devastating.
Give us the breakdown. Is it different for elementary versus junior high?
It is. For elementary school teachers, it's already alarmingly high. 33.5% work 60 hours or more per week, 1 in 3.
Okay, 1 in 3 elementary teachers' working hours linked to Karōshi risk.
But then you look at the junior high schools, where Bukatsu is often mandatory and academic pressure ramps up. The situation is, frankly, catastrophic. A staggering 57.7% of junior high school teachers work hours that meet or exceed that Karōshi criterion.
57.7%. Over half.
Over half. More than half of the entire junior high teaching workforce is structurally expected, it seems, to maintain a pace that is scientifically linked to potential fatal overwork.
Wait a minute, 57.7%.
Right.
That isn't just bad management or, a few demanding weeks. That points to a systemic cultural acceptance of human exhaustion as just a necessary part of the job in public service.
I think that's a fair assessment. It does seem baked into the system.
Yeah.
And if you need some context for just how extreme this is, look at notoriously demanding private sectors.
Like what? Restaurants? Finance?
Yeah, take the restaurant industry,
Yeah.
often cited for brutal hours, right? In 2016, analysis showed that about 28.4% of restaurant workers logged 60 hours or more per week.
Okay, 28.4%. Still high, but
But the public education sector, specifically junior high school teaching in Japan, has double the rate of that high-stress private industry. And furthermore, extensive analysis confirms the immediate consequence. The longer the work hours stretch beyond that 60-hour mark, the significantly worse the mental and physical health outcomes become for these educators. The system isn't just exhausting them, it seems to be actively harming them.
which brings us to this profound paradox, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Why do people stay? Why would anyone stay in a profession that seems systematically designed to destroy their work-life balance and potentially their health? There must be some incredible counterbalancing factor, right?
There is, and it's a deep psychological and moral benefit that creates what we can call the satisfaction dichotomy. It's really interesting.
Dichotomy. Meaning?
Meaning they feel two opposing things strongly. When teachers are surveyed about their sense of reward or fulfillment in their work, the meaning of the job, 85.2% express high satisfaction.
85%. That's really high.
It is. They feel great about the purpose, the actual teaching, the mentoring, seeing students develop and grow. The mission itself is clearly intrinsically rewarding for most of them.
But the conditions under which they have to fulfill that mission
Are unworkable.
Exactly.
Exactly. When those same teachers are asked about their satisfaction with their work-life balance, the number just plummets. It drops to 45.2%.
Less than half are satisfied with their work-life balance.
Correct. And this isn't a stable situation either. It's actually getting worse. That 45.2% figure had declined by 10.4 points just in the decade leading up to 2020. So the dissatisfaction with balance is growing.
So the struggle is really stark then. Teachers love what the vocational calling the purpose, but they're profoundly dissatisfied with how the systemic constraints, the exhausting conditions they're forced to work under.
Perfectly put. They are dedicated professionals being crushed by a bureaucratic structure that is supposed to support their mission, not hinder it.
And that analysis sets up our next major point perfectly, I think. This system is supposedly designed to create a whole person, that holistic ideal, yet it seems to be actively destroying the capacity of both the educators and, as we'll see, maybe the students too. So let's shift focus now to those philosophical underpinnings. What is it about the Japanese approach to education that has made it so globally admired, despite these issues? What's the ideal they're striving for?
Well, the Japanese system is, as you say, globally renowned for its emphasis on developing the whole person. It's about integrating intellectual development with social, emotional, and moral character building.
And this isn't just a recent trend, right? It's historical.
Oh, yes. It's not arbitrary at all. It's deeply rooted in Eastern philosophical traditions. You can see strong influences from Confucianism, which emphasizes things like duty, hierarchy, respect, and collective harmony.
Okay.
Then there's Shintoism, which promotes concepts like purity and a sense of shared community responsibility. And Buddhism also plays a role, introducing ideas about perseverance and ethical conduct.
So the ultimate goal isn't just churning out students with high test scores. It's about nurturing ethical, socially competent, community-minded citizens. Is that fair?
That's precisely the ideal. Education is seen as this process of continuous character refinement. It's not just about knowledge acquisition. And this ideal is then reinforced through 4 key structural pillars that are meant to deliver this holistic experience in schools.
Okay, let's quickly detail those pillars for listeners. What are they?
Right. First, there's the integrated curriculum. This means academic subjects are deliberately combined with moral, physical, and emotional education. They're woven into the fabric of the school day, reinforcing the idea that learning is inseparable from becoming a good person.
Okay, integrated curriculum. What's next?
Second, and this is central to your opening story, are the extracurricular activities, or Bukatsu. These are mandatory for junior high students and still highly popular in high school. They're specifically designed to foster teamwork, resilience, leadership skills, that sort of thing.
Got it. Bukatsu.
Third is formal moral education, called Dutoku. This involves dedicated class time specifically for discussing ethics, values, and character development. It's an explicit part of the curriculum.
Dudoku. Okay, and the fourth pillar?
Fourth is community involvement. This encourages students to participate actively in things like cleaning the school, a famous example, doing community service, and generally understanding their social responsibilities beyond the classroom.
Right. So on paper, it sounds like the ideal modern education model, doesn't it? Many Western countries are actively trying to figure out how to integrate these soft skills, and here Japan has institutionalized it for decades.
Exactly. The philosophical framework is widely admired.
Here comes the but. When you introduce that massive academic pressure, we talked about specifically the incredibly high-stakes entrance exams for high school and university, what happens to this idealistic system in practice?
Well, that's where the whole system starts to fracture. It leads to this massive disconnect, particularly at the student level, the intense pressure cooker environment, driven by fierce competition to get into the best high schools and then the best universities. It means the philosophy of holistic development gets completely overshadowed by the brutal reality of credentialism.
Credentialism wins out.
It seems to. And the data on student motivation is stark. We see that about 90% of polled Japanese students say they are studying primarily to pass the entrance exam.
90%. Wow. So their main motivation is purely external and transactional. It's not about curiosity or acquiring skills for the future or personal growth. It's just about clearing that one high-stakes hurdle.
Largely, yes. The goal passing the exam has completely distorted the means, the educational process itself. The high-stakes nature of this exam system, which can genuinely determine lifelong career trajectories, even social standing, pushes families to invest heavily in supplementary education outside of school, the famous juku, or cram schools.
Right, the cram schools.
And the consequence of that is that those holistic pillars like Bukatsu, they stop being seen as enriching activities in themselves. They become simply mandatory items to check off the list, Or worse, they're seen as grueling physical obstacles that just take precious time away from exam preparation.
So the true educational value, the character building, gets stripped away by the pressure.
Exactly. It becomes more about endurance than enrichment.
So if the students are overwhelmingly focused on rote memorization for exams, what does that do to their actual engagement level in the classroom? Where the teacher is trying to deliver that integrated, holistic curriculum.
Well, predictably, it leads to pretty high levels of disengagement. The sheer volume of content they have to cover, and the often mechanical nature of the exam preparation, it creates burnout, even for the students, not just the teachers.
Do we have data on student disengagement?
We do. And it's quite striking. Around 88% of Japanese students polled reported that they think about other things or do other things in the school hours. Basically, they're mentally checking out.
88% admit to not paying attention.
And it gets worse. 73% of students admitted that they have a doze in the class. They literally fall asleep. And for 34% of them, they said this was very much true, meaning it happens frequently.
Sleeping in class. Thinking about other things. So, just to recap, we have a system that demands the longest working hours globally from teachers, often running them past the point of safety.
Right.
Forcing them to administer this supposedly holistic curriculum, only for almost 90% of the students to be mentally checked out or even asleep, because their only real concern is the high-stakes exam looming down the track.
That sums up the tragic reality pretty well. And here's the heartbreaking irony, especially for the educators. 84% of those same incredibly overworked teachers say they want their students to focus on future skills.
Like critical thinking, creativity.
Exactly. Critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, the skills, everyone agrees, are vital for the 21st century. The professionals on the ground know the system is fundamentally misaligned. They see it failing its core purpose.
They recognize the problem.
They recognize that the relentless pursuit of narrow, easily measurable outcomes, like exam scores, is actively undermining the development of the very long-term skills that the country actually needs for things like national innovation and workforce competitiveness. They feel trapped in this high-effort, low-efficacy cycle.
Which brings us right back to where we started, that exhausted teacher on the baseball field. The Bukatsu practice should be the ultimate expression of character development, teamwork, resilience.
That's the ideal.
But instead, it's just become a required endurance test, mandated by a tradition that nobody seems to have the power to stop, running on the fumes of exhausted educators and, frankly, disengaged students. The system's inertia really does feel like the main villain here.
That really is the essence of the crisis.
Yeah.
And the natural follow-up question has to be, why? Why, with all this apparent consensus, teachers are unhappy, students are disengaged, the goals are misaligned? Why is the Japanese system so uniquely resistant to fundamental change? Why has this institutional inertia won out for so long?
That is the next crucial step for us then. We need to unpack why changing this high-pressure, high-workload environment seems so incredibly difficult. And you mentioned tracing the history, the institutional rigidity that seems tied to the system's original purpose.
Exactly. To understand the rigidity, you really have to go back to the foundation, which was laid during the Meiji Restoration, starting around 1868. The modern Japanese education system wasn't initially built for, say, universal enlightenment or individual fulfillment.
What was its purpose then?
It was primarily a state project for rapid modernization. The main goal was to quickly absorb Western technology and political systems, to create a unified, modern nation-state that could compete on the international stage. And that required a very specific kind of structure.
Which was?
Centralized and top-down. It had to be efficient for disseminating standardized knowledge quickly across the country.
And you mentioned this rapid modernization also created a focus on credentialism that still seems to be around today.
Absolutely. A key part of this was establishing the imperial university system. Its primary function was to train the top elite cramp. The bureaucrats, the military officers, the skilled engineers needed to run the new state.
So education became the main sorting mechanism.
Yes, it immediately established education as the primary engine of social sorting and class mobility. It cemented this powerful, credential-based society where your academic pedigree, often determined quite early in life, heavily dictates your future career trajectory and social standing. And that centralized administrative bedrock established back then is still, in many ways, what the current Ministry of Education has to operate within.
Okay, but then after World War II, there were massive reforms mandated by the Allied occupation, right? didn't those reforms break this centralized structure, introduce more democracy?
They introduced sweeping democratic changes, yes.
Yes.
The education system was fundamentally restructured into the single-track 6-3-3-4 system we see today. 6 years elementary, 3 junior high, 3 high school, 4 university. Co-education was enforced. These reforms massively increased popular access to education.
Which was a huge success for democratization.
Absolutely. A huge success in terms of access. However, crucially, these reforms didn't fundamentally dismantle the underlying culture of academic ranking and credentialism.
Ah, so the culture persisted.
It did. In fact, popular demand for higher education surged after the war, often outpacing the government's ability to actually build enough public capacity. Policy consistently lagged behind this public demand. This led to the growth of a sprawling private education sector, which helped absorb the sheer volume of students, but also maintained and perhaps even intensified the competitive ranking system.
Interesting. So the system became more democratic in its structure in terms of access, but it remained intensely elitist and credential-focused in its actual practice and cultural impact.
That's a very good way to put it. And this situation really sets the stage for the next major attempt to overhaul the system, which happened in the 1970s. We need to talk about the failure of what's sometimes called the third educational reform.
Okay, the third educational reform in the 70s. What was that about?
This was arguably the pivotal moment. It was the most comprehensive attempt to address the system's deep structural problems. The very problems contributing to the overload and rigidity we see today. In 1971, the Central Council for Education, a key advisory body, put forward some massive proposals.
What kind of proposals?
Their goal was basically to restructure everything. They wanted to reduce the curriculum overload, inject more flexibility into the system. They proposed some pretty radical structural changes, like maybe integrating early childhood education into a more flexible 4-4-6 structure instead of 6-3-3. They also aimed to overhaul university admissions.
Wow, those sound like sensible structural reforms that might have actually alleviated some of the workload and pressure issues we've been discussing. Why did they fail so completely? They were largely shelved, right?
Yes, they were mostly shelved. The failure really stemmed from a fatal combination of factors: fierce internal resistance from a key stakeholder group, and then a major external economic shock that pulled the rug out from under the whole initiative.
Okay, let's break that down. Who provided the internal resistance?
Internally, the primary opposition came from the very powerful Japan Teachers Union, the JTU, Nikkyoso, as it's known.
The teachers union. Why would they oppose reforms aimed at potentially improving the system? What were their specific concerns, ideologically?
Well, the JTU's ideology was deeply rooted in the post-war ideals of educational democratization. They emphasized teacher autonomy and educational equality above almost everything else. They viewed the CCE's proposals, which involved more central planning and diversification, as a kind of top-down authoritarian attempt by the Ministry of Education to strengthen administrative control over teachers and, crucially, to promote elitism.
Elitism? How so?
They feared that introducing more flexibility and diversification, like different tracks or structures, would just lead to earlier academic sorting of students. They believed this would undermine the principle of equity and equal opportunity for all. So they opposed the reforms on very fundamental ideological grounds, seeing them as a dangerous step backward towards pre-war bureaucratic control and social stratification through education.
So it was a clash of visions, the administrators perhaps seeking efficiency and diversification, while the union prioritized equity and teacher autonomy, fearing central control.
Exactly, and the JTU was incredibly strong and well-organized at that time. They were able to mobilize sufficient political and public opposition to essentially paralyzed the administration's ability to push the reforms forward. It created a political deadlock.
Okay, so internal ideological conflict paralyzed the reforms. What was the external economic shock that you said cemented the failure?
That was the 1973 oil shock. Japan's economy, being highly dependent on imported oil, was hit incredibly hard. It plunged into a recession, leading to a massive government budget deficit almost overnight.
Ah, the oil crisis.
Right. And implementing those ambitious, complex, and politically contentious structural reforms proposed by the CCE would have required enormous financial investment from the government. New schools, retraining teachers, administrative changes. It was expensive.
And suddenly the money wasn't there.
Exactly. In the new environment of financial crisis, retrenchment and urgent belt-tightening, making such large-scale, controversial changes became politically and economically impossible. Any political will that might have existed instantly evaporated. The inertia of the existing, cheaper status quo prevailed. The reform moment was lost.
So the structure remained rigid, the curriculum stayed overloaded, the exam pressure continued, and the teacher workload persisted. Was there anything successful that came out of those 1970s attempts at reform? Any small wins?
There was one highly significant measure that was implemented, though in hindsight, it might have acted as more of a structural distraction than a solution. This was a law passed in 1974, specifically aimed at securing capable educational personnel.
Securing capable teachers, what did that involve?
Well, the government recognized that Japan's rapid economic growth in the preceding decades meant the private sector was booming and offering much higher salaries. This was drawing talented potential teachers away from the profession. They realized they needed to make teaching financially competitive again to ensure a supply of quality educators for this system.
So they addressed the pay issue.
They did, dramatically. The 1974 law led to significant raises for teachers, something like 30% increases between 1974 and 1978. It effectively addressed the long-standing issue of honest poverty, seihin, that teachers had often faced, especially since the Meiji era. It made teaching a respectable, middle-class, competitive career path again.
Okay, so that was a success in terms of recruitment and retention, presumably.
Precisely. It successfully increased the supply of highly qualified, capable individuals entering the teaching profession. It was a definite tactical victory for ensuring personnel quality.
I sense a but coming.
But, and this is the absolutely crucial point, this law only addressed the salary. It provided a much better financial incentive for excellent people to join and endure the existing system. It did absolutely nothing to change the fundamental structure of that system. It didn't reduce the mandatory workload. It didn't reform the exam-centric curriculum. It didn't tackle the Bukatsu burden. It didn't lessen the administrative load.
So essentially, they just paid people more to tolerate the burnout machine, but they refused to actually dismantle or even significantly overhaul the machine itself.
That's a blunt but accurate way to put it. The salary fix papered over the cracks for a while by ensuring good people kept coming in, but it avoided the much harder, more politically difficult task of fundamental structural reform.
Wow. That story perfectly illustrates the kind of institutional inertia you were talking about. The system seems so heavy, so resistant to fundamental shifts. It seems only capable of applying these kinds of band-aids or relief measures that treat the symptoms like low pay or maybe a shortage of talent, rather than actually curing the underlying disease of structural overwork, centralization, and misaligned goals.
It really demonstrates how a system, once established for a specific purpose like rapid national development, can come to view itself as fundamentally sound, only requiring optimization around the edges. Deep, painful structural change, the kind that would require the political will to seriously challenge the entrenched interests of powerful groups like the JTU and the administrative establishment simultaneously. That remains incredibly elusive in the Japanese context.
Okay, so given that Japan has clearly struggled so profoundly to implement meaningful change from within, let's pivot, let's look outwards. How have other nations, particularly those also facing similar pressures, trying to balance academic rigor with student well-being, how have they successfully navigated major educational reform? What does a successful structural shift actually look like internationally?
That's a great question, and comparative analysis here is really critical. We can look at two very different but widely regarded as highly successful models, Finland and Singapore. They both offer powerful, though distinct counterpoints to Japan's approach, especially regarding teacher management, autonomy, and assessment.
Okay, let's start with Finland. It's often held up as the gold standard, isn't it? Particularly for prioritizing teacher capacity and well-being. What was their big structural shift? How did they move away from rigidity?
Finland's story is fascinating. Starting back in the 1970s, around the same time Japan's big reform failed, Finland made a conscious decision to shift away from a highly centralized, test-centric system, which actually had some similarities to Japan's rigidity at the time, towards a system built almost entirely on trust and local autonomy.
Trust in teachers.
Exactly. Their key strategy was a massive, sustained investment in building teacher capacity. They fundamentally changed how they viewed and treated teachers.
What does that investment look like in practice? What do they actually do?
Well, first, it requires all teachers, from elementary level upwards, to hold a master's degree. Teacher education is university-based and research-oriented. And critically, this education is fully subsidized by the state. It's free, and often includes a living stipend during the preparation years.
Wow, free master's degrees for all teachers.
Yes, and entry into these teacher education programs is fiercely competitive. Often less than 15% of applicants are admitted. It's as competitive as getting into medicine or law.
So they're highly selective.
Extremely. The underlying Finnish view seems to be, if you select and train the absolute best people, you can then empower them. You trust them to be autonomous professionals making sound pedagogical decisions in their local context, rather than treating them like centralized technicians just following orders from above.
Which sounds like the inverse of the Japanese structure we've discussed, where workload and curriculum are often dictated very centrally, potentially stripping away teacher autonomy.
Precisely. And this professional autonomy in Finland translates directly into the classroom experience and, crucially, the workload. They built in structured collaboration time. This is key.
Collaboration time, meaning?
Finnish teachers are mandated to have extensive regular time, usually at least one afternoon every week, dedicated solely to joint curriculum planning, professional development activities, and collaborative problem solving with their peers within their school.
And this isn't just if you can find the time.
No. This time is respected, it's paid, it's built into their schedules. It's viewed as absolutely essential for building collective capacity and ensuring quality, not some optional extra to be squeezed in after hours.
That sounds revolutionary compared to the Japanese context of individual teachers battling overwhelming workloads in isolation.
It's a fundamentally different approach to professional life. And furthermore, their assessment methodology is radically different. They rely heavily on extensive, narrative, formative feedback from the teacher. There is virtually no external standardized testing used to rank students or schools.
No standardized testing for ranking. Really?
Almost none. The only major exception is the matriculation examination at the very end of upper secondary school, which is used for university entry. But throughout K-12, the focus is on teacher-led, holistic assessment for learning, not testing for ranking.
So that effectively eliminates the central driver of test-centric burnout and the teaching to the test phenomenon that seems to plague the Japanese system.
Exactly. It frees teachers and students to focus on genuine, deep, holistic learning, rather than just exam preparation. It fundamentally tackles the structural drivers of fatigue and the narrow focus of assessment, which appear to be Japan's core weaknesses.
Okay, Finland is one model: high trust, high autonomy, deep investment in teachers, minimal standardized testing. What about Singapore? Their cultural context, like Japan's, values academic achievement incredibly intensely. How did they manage to pursue holistic integration without sacrificing that academic rigor?
Singapore provides a fascinating and perhaps more relevant model of what we could call managed holistic integration. They didn't try to eliminate the cultural value placed on academics. Instead, they used careful policy layering and structural adjustments to manage those cultural expectations while still broadening the definition of success.
Policy layering, what does that mean?
It means they understood you can't just issue a decree telling parents and students to stop valuing academic achievement overnight. That cultural drive is too strong. So instead, they systematically shifted policy emphasis over several distinct phases, going back as far as 1965. They gradually introduced and embedded holistic goals, things like formal character and citizenship education, CCE frameworks, socio-emotional learning, SEL competencies, directly into the national curriculum alongside academics.
So they added layers of holistic focus onto the existing academic structure?
Yes, but they also made crucial structural changes to the academic system itself, specifically to address the intense pressure caused by rigid sorting systems, which is a major issue in Japan too.
What kind of structural changes did Singapore make?
One key initiative was implementing full subject-based banding, or FFBB. Historically, Singapore, like many systems, used rigid streaming. Students were tested early, labeled Easy Express, normal academic, normal technical, and then locked into that path with limited mobility.
Which can be very high stakes and stigmatizing.
Extremely. FSBB was designed to break down this rigidity. It allows students, particularly at the secondary level, to take different subjects at different achievement levels based on their individual strengths and interests.
So a student isn't just in one stream for everything.
Exactly. A student might be strong in languages and take English and mother tongue at a more demanding G3 level, but perhaps finds math more challenging and takes it at a G2 or G1 level with more foundational support.
That sounds like a really powerful way to mitigate that single make-or-break assessment pressure. It acknowledges diverse abilities within a student rather than applying one rigid label based on an aggregate score.
Precisely. It makes the system more flexible, it reduces the stigma associated with being placed in a supposedly lower stream, and it allows for more customized learning pathways. Singapore achieved this through strong, centralized policy control and extensive government infrastructure, including very tight links between the Ministry of Education and the National Institute of Education, which trains all the teachers to carefully steer the entire system towards these more holistic outcomes while still maintaining undeniably high academic standards overall.
It sounds like a very deliberate, managed approach. However, even in Singapore, with these successful policy layers and structural changes like FSBB, that underlying cultural desire for narrow academic achievement, for getting into the right university course, that hasn't completely vanished, has it?
No, it hasn't.
Yeah.
And that is the absolutely essential caveat and perhaps a warning for any potential reform in Japan. The undeniable success of the Singaporean policy model coexists with a massive, thriving shadow education system.
I mean private tuition. Cram schools again.
Exactly. Ubiquitous tuition centers, enrichment classes. It's a huge industry, still driven largely by parents who are chasing the narrowest possible academic outcomes, particularly for highly competitive university admissions.
So even with smart systemic reforms, the cultural pressure persists.
It illustrates the monumental difficulty involved. Policy reform can effectively change structures and broaden definitions of success within the formal system. But shifting deeply ingrained cultural expectations and anxieties, rooted in generations of credentialism and competition, that is a far harder, longer-term battle, even when the systemic reforms are well-designed and implemented.
That's a really important point. It's fascinating, then, that while Japan struggles with its own system, some of its core philosophical methods, the very holistic ideals that are getting crushed by bureaucracy domestically are actually seen as a potential solution elsewhere. You mentioned the challenge of adapting Japanese holistic methods in international settings, like in Ukrainian higher education.
Yes, it's an interesting side note that highlights the perceived value of the Japanese ideals themselves, separate from the flawed implementation. The inherent worth of Japan's traditional holistic principles, the focus on ethical conduct, social skills, emotional development, collective responsibility, is widely acknowledged globally.
So others are trying to borrow these ideas.
In some contexts, yes. In Ukraine, for instance, there have been documented attempts, particularly in higher education, to adapt some of these methods. Educators there recognize their potential to foster crucial character traits and social competencies that they felt might be lacking in their own more individualistically focused system.
Okay, but you mentioned it was a challenge. What was the main obstacle when trying to transplant these Japanese ideas?
The major obstacle reported was the profound divergence in underlying cultural philosophies between the two contexts.
How did that cultural difference manifest itself in practice in an academic setting?
Well, as we discussed, Japan's holistic education is built upon a foundation of Confucian and Shinto values, emphasizing things like collective responsibility, group harmony, diligence and service to the group, cleaning together, etc. The Ukrainian academic tradition, in contrast, like many Western traditions, historically places a much heavier emphasis on individualistic academic achievement, intellectual bait, critical inquiry, and research output.
Different priorities.
Fundamentally different priorities and assumptions about the purpose of education and the role of the individual within the institution. So trying to introduce something like mandatory collective cleaning duties or team-based Bukatsu-style extracurricular activities that demand significant time and group commitment, it requires a massive cultural shift. Faculty and students accustomed to prioritizing individual intellectual excellence above all else may resist or simply not understand the value of these collective, character-focused activities.
So it proves the Japanese ideals might be valuable, but they aren't easily plug and play. Their transferability is limited without a deep cultural resonance or a willingness to undergo that significant cultural shift.
Exactly. It underscores that the philosophy itself has merit, but its implementation is deeply intertwined with cultural context. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with this really agonizing irony, aren't we? The core principles underpinning Japanese education, this emphasis on whole person development, on character, on social skills, on community, these are globally recognized. They're often praised, even adopted internationally, as you saw with the Ukraine example, because they seem necessary for raising well-rounded 21st century citizens. Their inherent value seems proven.
Right. The philosophy isn't the problem.
Not at all. Yet domestically, within Japan itself, the institutional structures, those built way back in the Meiji era for nation building and largely maintained by post-war inertia and failed reforms, these structures have imposed a genuinely suffocating workload on teachers and a high-pressure, narrow, test-centric reality on students.
crushing the ideals under the weight of the system.
Precisely. The core tension lies right there. A system that espouses these wonderful ideals of whole person development, yet is structurally designed in a way that seems to crush the capacity, the energy, and often the motivation of the very people, both the educators and the students, who are supposed to be benefiting from and enacting that philosophy. It turns high ideals into high stress, long hours, and distressingly often low engagement.
That really is the perfect synthesis of this systemic failure, I think. It leads to a clear takeaway. The real challenge facing Japanese education today isn't about inventing some new groundbreaking educational philosophy. The one they already have is, in principle, respected worldwide, and its potential benefits are clear if it could actually be realized. The true monumental difficulty lies in acquiring the institutional will, the political courage, really to finally dismantle those deeply entrenched structural traditions. The traditions of overwork, of excessive centralization, of inflexible curriculum, of the overwhelming power of the entrance exams. It means confronting the inertia that prevents those existing, respected, holistic ideals from actually being translated into a healthy, sustainable reality for teachers and students.
It requires challenging the very foundations of that Meiji-era administrative battleship, as you called it earlier.
Exactly. It's a challenge that, as we've seen, has been largely avoided or deflected since at least the 1970s. And by avoiding it, the system seems trapped, thereby trapping everyone within it, from that tired teacher you saw on the baseball field right down to the disengaged or sleeping student in the classroom, trapping them all in this exhausting and ultimately unsustainable cycle of profound exhaustion.